I watched a few songs on YouTube the other day, and a few other things as well, but it's just made me think. Wasn't the 90s the best decade? Typical 17-year-old. I was born in 1994, but I still remember the 90s, and I always think, for that reason, I am a 90s kid. Some people usually say, though, if you were born in the late 80s and you grew up in the 90s, you were a 90s kid. But I always put it along the lines of memory. If you can remember the time, then you were, well, a child of that time, especially when you were younger. The 90s was the golden years of children's television. Hands down, the golden years of children's television. Oh, they had everything. Rugrats. Oh, they had everything. So many of them which I forgot now, but there's so many shows which I remember watching when I was younger. And they just play an effect on you. They just... Teletubbies is one of them, yes. I remember coming home from school every day and sitting on their old chairs, which people used to have back then. Well, which people still do have that back then. It's, I'm sounding like I'm speaking from something which happened about 50 years ago, but for some reason nobody has those giant, nice leather sofas, which I remember when they used to cost thousands upon thousands of pounds, and there were, yeah, flowers, decoration flowers going all over them and everything. No one seems to have that nowadays no more. Back in the 90s everyone did. Yeah, I remember back when I used to come home from school every day, and my mum always used to give us these chocolate buttons and sweets, and we used to sit in front of the TV, and the televisions, yes, the television those days were giant square boxes about 8 feet across and 5 feet thick, and they were about 4 feet high, and yeah, they were fuzzily picture every time you used to switch them on. And we always used to have a VHS video recorder which you used to put in, and I watched my first movie, well, my first proper movie, which wasn't a cartoon, Jurassic Park, on there when I was about 4 years old, which I absolutely loved. And that was just one of the highlights of the movies back then. I mean, the 90s as well had the best, it was the decade of the best movies. It was great. Some people might dispute me on that one though. Some people might say it was the 80s, but I have seen a lot of 80s movies, but I have to admit that there is more 90s. The quality of movie coming out from the 90s does overmatch the 80s movies. The cars of the 90s. I'll never forget them. I mean, seriously, they weren't the best looking cars. Through history, if you look back through cars from the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, really nice. Then 70s, well, reasonably okay. Then the 80s started to come along, and they started to become more like boxes. And then the 90s, well, I could have been sworn my parents were driving around in a box. I do remember distinctly 90s cars. Air conditioning was a luxury, and electronic windows. If a car had an electronic windows in them, then you were very lucky, and slightly wealthy, because they were usually expensive. Well, I thought they were, well. And the smell. Because the air conditioning wasn't good in those days, all the smells of the car used to stick around and everything. That was pretty cool. I always remember those smells, definitely, yeah. Oh yes, and there wasn't such thing as DVDs, so we had the old videotape recorders with the tiny tapes which used to plug into the DVD, and sometimes it always used to crackle and take a while to play. So if you had certain technology in your car, you knew you were quite wealthy. Oh look, that car's got electronic windows. Wow! I remember when I think it was like year 1, and they just started to put computers in. That was cool. I remember the first years using computers. Those days were when you went on a computer and it was really fun. You didn't take it for granted. You just didn't want to come off it. But nowadays, every household has a computer. I remember when the teacher used to come around the classroom and say, "This homework has to be in a certain day of the year for blah 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 and this. If you have a computer, Windows 95 and Windows 97, yes, when you always used to press the on button, it took an hour to load. And those were back in the days when technology wasn't as reliable as it is now. Well, it still isn't really reliable anyway. But that's it from me. I'm just recording a few memories from the 90s. If any of you guys have anything similar, then please feel free to share them. I mean, I do remember them very well, and hopefully let's wish for a second 90s decade, because that was a very good decade. And like I said, I was only little, but I still remember a lot from it. And yeah. As for me, however, goodbye.